When we talk about the Ukraine war, the spotlight usually falls on Russia and the West. But behind the scenes, far from the battlefield, there's another player. Quiet, calculating, and more influential than many realize. China has not fired a single shot in Ukraine, yet its decisions are shaping the entire course of the war. From discounted oil deals to silent technology transfers, from peace talks that go nowhere to global financial maneuverings, Beijing's fingerprints are everywhere, though rarely acknowledged. This is the untold story of how China's silent role in Ukraine may decide not only the fate of Europe, but the balance of world power for decades to come. Imagine a war fought not only with missiles, tanks, and drones, but with silence, trade deals, and quiet handshakes behind closed doors. While the world's cameras remain fixated on Ukraine's bombed-out cities, Russian offensives, and Western weapons shipments, another great power sits quietly in the shadows, shaping the outcome of this conflict without firing a single shot. That power is China, and its role in the Ukraine war is far more complex, subtle, and strategic than most people realize. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the immediate narrative was clear. The West rallied behind Kiev with billions in military aid, sanctions, and diplomatic support, while Moscow faced isolation, economic collapse, and mounting losses. But Russia did not collapse, and one of the biggest reasons is China. China did not send tanks or troops, it did not openly arm Russia's military, and it did not stand in front of cameras declaring allegiance to Putin's war. Instead, it became Russia's silent economic lifeline, giving Russia just enough breathing room to survive under Western pressure, while ensuring that Beijing itself avoided the direct consequences of sanctions. Without China's quiet backing, Russia would be in a much deeper crisis, both militarily and economically, and the war might look very different today. The most visible lifeline comes in the form of trade. Before the war, Europe was Russia's biggest customer, buying gas, oil, and countless raw materials, creating hundreds of billions in annual trade flows. But after the invasion, Europe slammed the door shut. Sanctions cut Russia off from European markets, froze hundreds of billions in assets, and stopped technology exports. Moscow had one option: turn to the east, and China was ready. Trade between the two countries skyrocketed. In 2021, their trade value stood at around $147 billion, but by 2024, it had exploded to over $240 billion, the highest in history. China became Russia's #1 trading partner, and crucially, its #1 buyer of energy. When Europe cut its oil purchases, Beijing stepped in. Today, more than 40% of Russian oil exports flow to China, and they don't come at market price. Beijing has been negotiating steep discounts, sometimes $20 to $30 per barrel cheaper than global benchmarks. For Russia, it's survival cash. For China, it's cheap fuel to power its massive industrial economy. Beyond oil, Chinese companies fill the gaps left by Western corporations that exited Russia. From cars to electronics, from smartphones to consumer goods, Chinese brands have flooded Russian markets, replacing Western logos on shelves and streets. Even microchips, drones, and components with potential military applications have found their way from China to Russia, despite denials from Beijing. This economic oxygen allows Moscow to keep its war machine running even while under the heaviest sanctions in modern history. But why doesn't China go further? Why doesn't Beijing openly provide Russia with military equipment or troops? The answer lies in strategy. China plays a dual game. On one side, it wants Russia to survive, because a weakened Russia keeps the West distracted in Europe, giving China more freedom to expand in Asia and challenge the United States in the Pacific. On the other side, China cannot afford Western sanctions on itself. The United States and the European Union are still China's largest trading partners, far more valuable than Russia. If Beijing openly armed Russia, it would risk losing access to trillions of dollars in Western markets, advanced technologies, and global investment. The cost would be devastating for China's economy. So Beijing walks a fine line. It supports Russia economically in ways that are hard to directly punish, while presenting itself to the world as neutral. It's a balancing act, and so far, it's working. In 2023, Beijing even launched what it called a peace plan for Ukraine. On paper, it promoted sovereignty, an end to hostilities, and dialogue between both sides. But the plan never condemned Russia's invasion. Instead, it criticized Western sanctions, subtly placed blame on NATO, and painted China as a neutral peacemaker. For Beijing, it wasn't about solving the war, it was about optics. China wanted to look responsible, to appear like a global statesman while continuing to buy discounted oil and sell critical goods to Russia. The peace plan was never designed to end the war, but rather to shape global perception, especially among countries in the global south, that China was a mediator rather than a silent backer of Moscow. But the bigger truth is this: China doesn't care about Ukraine, and it doesn't care about Russia's victory or defeat in a moral sense. What it cares about is power. Russia's war in Ukraine gives China three enormous advantages. First, it distracts the West. As Washington and Brussels pour money, weapons, and political capital into Ukraine, they have less energy to focus on Asia, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. Second, it gives China access to cheap resources, because Russia, desperate for money, has no choice but to sell oil, gas, and coal at bargain prices. And third, it strengthens China's grip on Moscow. The longer the war drags on, the more dependent Russia becomes on China. Russia, once the senior partner in their relationship during the Cold War, now increasingly plays the junior role, reliant on Chinese markets and technology to survive. In short, Russia's bloody gamble in Ukraine may be draining Moscow, but it's empowering Beijing. This is the silent role of China in the Ukraine war, not through tanks or bombs, but through trade deals, discounted oil, diplomatic cover, and the careful manipulation of global perception. The world watches the front lines in Kharkiv and Donbass, but the real power game stretches thousands of miles away in Beijing's strategy rooms, where China plays a long, patient game, ensuring that no matter who wins or loses in Ukraine, China comes out stronger.
China's role in the Ukraine war is not only about buying oil or filling Russian shelves with Chinese products. It is about carefully balancing between East and West, playing both sides while pretending to be neutral, and positioning itself as the true power broker in a divided world. To understand Beijing's silent strategy, we need to see the world through China's eyes. When the war broke out, Xi Jinping was confronted with both an opportunity and a risk. The opportunity was clear. Russia's isolation meant China could step in and expand its influence over a resource-rich neighbor. But the risk was just as great. If Beijing openly supported Russia, it could trigger massive sanctions from the United States and the European Union, which together still make up China's largest trading markets. The European Union alone is China's second largest trade partner after ASEAN, and the United States is close behind. Losing access to these markets would devastate China's export-driven economy, cause unemployment to surge, and even threaten internal political stability. So Xi Jinping crafted a strategy of strategic ambiguity, never condemning Russia, never supporting the West, and instead presenting China as the cautious mediator who understands both sides. This is why Beijing abstained from United Nations resolutions that condemned the invasion instead of vetoing them outright. It's why Chinese diplomats always use vague language, speaking of security concerns rather than aggression when describing Russia's invasion. The goal is simple. Don't isolate Russia, but don't isolate China either. Beijing wants to be the country that everyone, whether Moscow, Kiev, Washington, or Brussels, still needs to talk to. That's the diplomatic layer of China's silent role. But beneath it lies something even more interesting: the economic re-engineering of Eurasia. By deepening trade ties with Russia, Beijing is accelerating what analysts call the de-dollarization of global trade. For decades, oil and gas were sold almost exclusively in US dollars. But today, Russia sells large portions of its energy to China in yuan.
This shift is not just a financial detail. It represents a slow challenge to America's dominance of the global financial system. The more countries use the yuan for energy and trade, the more powerful China's currency becomes, and the more Beijing can insulate itself from US sanctions. The Ukraine war has provided Beijing with a perfect laboratory to test this experiment. Moscow, cut off from the dollar and the euro, has little choice but to accept China's terms. This has turned Russia into a junior partner in the so-called no-limits partnership Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin declared just weeks before the invasion. In theory, no limits meant equality. In practice, it means Russia increasingly depends on China for survival, while China grows stronger from discounted energy and political leverage. This brings us to the paradox at the heart of Beijing's strategy. China benefits from Russia's survival, but it also benefits from Russia's weakness. A strong, victorious Russia could become a rival again in Central Asia, in arms exports, or in influence over developing nations. But a weakened Russia, isolated, sanctioned, desperate, has no choice but to lean on Beijing. This is the sweet spot for China. Russia survives just enough to keep the West distracted, but not enough to regain its former strength. Beijing's silent hand is shaping this balance in ways the world rarely notices. But there is also a danger in this game. By aligning too closely with Russia, even quietly, China risks alienating Europe. And Europe is central to Beijing's global ambitions. Xi Jinping's massive Belt and Road initiative relies on trade corridors that stretch across Eurasia into European markets. China sells cars, electronics, and countless goods to the EU, and European companies bring advanced technology, investment, and prestige. If China's role in supporting Russia becomes too obvious, Europe may decide to follow the US path of economic decoupling, shifting supply chains away from China and imposing technology restrictions. This is why Beijing plays its role with silence and subtlety, always helping Moscow enough to matter, but never so openly that it pushes Brussels or Berlin into Washington's arms. For now, it seems to be working. While the US openly warns about China's support for Russia, Europe remains more cautious, unwilling to fully break with Beijing. Leaders in Paris, Berlin, and Rome know that their economies rely on Chinese trade, and Beijing exploits this hesitation skillfully, offering just enough diplomatic rhetoric about peace and stability to keep Europe hopeful that China can play a constructive role. But is China really a peacemaker? The so-called peace plan Beijing released in 2023 is a case study in strategic messaging. On the surface, it looks like a roadmap to end the war. Ceasefire, negotiations, humanitarian aid. But on closer inspection, it avoids the key issue, Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. Without addressing that, the plan is meaningless as a peace settlement. Yet it works brilliantly as propaganda. To audiences in Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, regions weary of US dominance, the Chinese plan looks like a genuine alternative to Western war-making. This helps Beijing build alliances in the global South, portraying itself as the voice of reason, while America fuels conflict. It's soft power at its finest. And this is where China's silent role stretches beyond Ukraine itself. By leveraging the war, Beijing is not just shaping Russia's survival, it is reshaping global alignments. Nations frustrated with Western dominance are increasingly drawn to China's narrative of neutrality, sovereignty, and anti-sanctions. This is how Beijing quietly builds a coalition of sympathetic states ready to support its vision of a multipolar world. Of course, this comes with contradictions. China often speaks of sovereignty and non-interference, yet it supports Russia, which has violated both in Ukraine. But Beijing's message is not about consistency, it's about influence. And in today's chaotic world, influence matters more than principle. Now, let's think about what China risks if this balance collapses. If Russia loses too badly, Beijing could face an unstable partner, a desperate neighbor whose collapse might bring chaos to Central Asia, refugee flows, and a stronger NATO presence near China's strategic frontiers. But if Russia somehow wins big, China might face a resurgent Kremlin that feels less dependent and possibly more ambitious in areas like arms exports or influence in countries along China's Belt and Road routes. Neither extreme serves Beijing's interests. The ideal outcome for China is a prolonged war of attrition, long enough to weaken Russia and exhaust the West, but not so destructive that Moscow collapses entirely. This explains why China never pushes too hard for peace, but also never allows Russia to suffocate. Silent support ensures the war drags on, but Beijing avoids the costs of fighting it directly. It is a cold calculation, but one that fits China's long-term view of history. Wars are not about quick victories, but about shaping the balance of power for decades. And Beijing knows that every month the West spends billions in Ukraine is a month not spent preparing for Asia. This brings us to the heart of China's strategy: Taiwan. For Xi Jinping, Ukraine is not just about Europe. It is a test case for what the West might do if China attempts to seize Taiwan. By observing how Washington and Brussels handle Russia, Beijing learns valuable lessons about sanctions, military aid, and global reactions. If the West struggles to sustain support for Ukraine, it signals to China that Western unity may crumble in a Taiwan crisis as well. And so, while the war rages in Europe, Beijing is quietly running simulations, studying every Western move, and preparing for its own future conflicts. In this sense, China's silent role is not only about saving Russia, but about rehearsing for Taiwan. Beijing does not need to fire a shot in Ukraine to gain what it wants: intelligence, leverage, alliances, and influence. The world sees Ukraine as Europe's war, but for China, it is part of a much larger game, one where patience, trade, and quiet maneuvering matter more than military power.
China's silent role in the Ukraine war cannot be understood without looking at the long-term consequences of its choices and the way this conflict reshapes the global order. For Beijing, every decision made since February 2022 has been about more than helping Russia survive. It has been about positioning itself as the alternative pole of power to the United States and its allies. The Ukraine war, in China's eyes, is not just Europe's tragedy. It is a strategic opportunity to accelerate the shift from a unipolar world dominated by Washington to a multipolar one where Beijing stands as a central pillar. To see how this works, let us first examine the battlefield of economics. By supporting Russia through trade, buying discounted oil, and providing goods to replace Western brands, China has effectively created a parallel system of survival that bypasses Western sanctions. This is not just about keeping Moscow alive. It is about proving to the world that Western sanctions are not unbeatable. If Russia can endure, thanks to China's support, then other nations may conclude that defying the United States is possible if Beijing is on their side. This message is not lost on countries under pressure from Washington. Iran, Venezuela, even smaller states wary of U.S. dominance, look to China's support for Russia and see hope that they too can find lifelines outside the Western system. Thus, the Ukraine war becomes a showcase for China's emerging global role, not the military ally, but the economic savior. Beijing sells this role carefully, framing itself as the protector of sovereignty and stability, while quietly using Russia as a test subject for new economic arrangements. The rise of yuan-based trade is the clearest example. By forcing Russia to accept payments in Chinese currency, Beijing expands the yuan's international use, slowly building the foundations of a financial system that might one day rival the dollar. For decades, U.S. global dominance has rested not only on military might, but on the dollar's centrality to world trade. If Beijing can undermine that dominance by spreading yuan usage across Asia, Africa, and beyond, it would shift power without firing a single bullet. Russia's desperation makes this possible, and Ukraine's war is the catalyst. Yet there is another, more subtle battlefield: information. While the West frames the war as a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, China avoids moralizing. Instead, it promotes narratives of sovereignty, anti-sanctions, and peace through dialogue. This resonates strongly in the global South, where many nations see Western hypocrisy in past wars like Iraq or Libya. For these audiences, Beijing's refusal to condemn Russia looks less like complicity and more like independence. China knows it cannot win over Washington or London, but it can win over New Delhi, Brasilia, Pretoria, and dozens of other capitals that want alternatives to Western dominance. In this sense, Ukraine is not only about Moscow's survival, but about Beijing's soft power competition with the United States. But every advantage comes with a cost. Beijing faces real risks in this silent strategy. If Russia collapses militarily or politically, China could be left with chaos on its northern border. An unstable Russia could spill insecurity into Central Asia, a region crucial for China's Belt and Road Initiative. Refugee flows, extremism, or even the rise of local warlords could destabilize trade routes and energy supplies. Beijing does not want a failed state next door. On the other hand, if Russia somehow achieves a major military breakthrough, capturing large parts of Ukraine and consolidating control, it could regain confidence and independence, reducing its reliance on Beijing. That could make Moscow more of a competitor than a client. Beijing prefers the middle ground, a Russia that is weakened, isolated but not destroyed, dependent but not gone. This is why China avoids pushing too hard for a peace deal, but also avoids letting Moscow suffocate. It provides just enough oxygen for the war to continue, ensuring that Russia stays on life support and in Beijing's orbit. This cynical calculation highlights the cold logic of geopolitics. For China, Ukraine is not about morality, but about managing Russia's decline in ways that benefit Beijing. Another arena where this silent role is critical is military technology. Officially, China does not supply Russia with weapons.
Beijing fears triggering Western sanctions if caught arming Moscow, but reports and investigations suggest that dual-use technologies, drones, chips, machinery, flow quietly from Chinese firms to Russian buyers. These goods are not labeled as military, but they often end up on the battlefield. This gray zone allows Beijing to maintain plausible deniability while still keeping Russia supplied. The West knows this, but struggles to stop it without risking escalation in its own trade war with China. Thus, Beijing has found a loophole. Support Russia just enough to keep it alive, but never openly enough to trigger massive retaliation. It is the art of silent partnership, and it keeps Moscow fighting while keeping Beijing safe. Now, consider how all of this ties back to China's ultimate concern, Taiwan. Every move in Ukraine is studied in Beijing as a lesson for a future conflict in the Pacific. How quickly did the West respond? How unified were NATO and the EU? How effective are sanctions in crippling an economy? Which technologies are restricted and which find their way through gray markets? These questions are not abstract. They are directly applied to China's Taiwan strategy. If Beijing ever decides to move on the island, it will already have a detailed playbook based on how Russia endured in Ukraine. And here lies the most chilling conclusion. The Ukraine war is not just Europe's tragedy, it is Asia's rehearsal. For China, the longer the war drags on, the more data it gathers, the more prepared it becomes for its own ambitions. The world sees Ukraine as the front line of freedom. Beijing sees it as a classroom. This makes China's silent role even more dangerous than it appears. But will this strategy last? There are cracks. Inside China, the economy is slowing. Youth unemployment is high, debt is rising, and global investors are cautious. Some Chinese elites worry that too much alignment with Russia could backfire, pushing Europe and America into deeper hostility with Beijing. Others argue that neutrality has already given China a massive advantage: access to cheap energy, leverage over Moscow, and a growing reputation as the leader of a multipolar world.
Xi Jinping believes time is on his side, that patience will deliver victories where armies fail. But history is unpredictable, and wars rarely stay under control. A sudden collapse in Russia could force Beijing into choices it does not want to make. A sudden Western breakthrough in sanctions could trap Chinese companies. A sudden NATO escalation could bring new dangers. China's silent role is powerful, but it is also fragile. It relies on balance, ambiguity, and endless patience. If any of these collapse, Beijing could find itself trapped by the very war it sought to exploit. But as of today, the gamble seems to be working. Russia fights on, weakened but not destroyed. The West bleeds resources into Ukraine, and China grows stronger from discounted oil and expanded global influence. And all the while, Beijing's fingerprints remain faint, its role hidden in silence, its strategy cloaked in neutrality. This is the true genius of China's silent role: to shape the war without owning it, to profit from the struggle without being blamed for it, to let others burn while it watches, calculates, and waits. The story of Ukraine will be told in terms of Russia and the West, but the silent player in the shadows may be the one who gains the most. When future historians look back, they may say that while Russia fought and Ukraine suffered, the real winner was China. Not because it fired a shot, but because it played the war like a chess game, moving pieces invisibly, always planning 3 steps ahead and quietly reshaping the world in its favor.